Welcome to our third discussion of Kant. We're halfway through and we've touched upon the preface. So you can't study the Critique of Pure Reason in 5 weeks. This is not a new discovery. And my purpose, though, is that we will still look at passages across the text to try and get a picture of the whole. If there are people interested in further study, we will do a 10-week course on Kant and modernity or something. But yeah, for the moment though, we have our restrictions. So what I thought, I sent that revised schedule around, and we're going to begin with some boring terminological discussion, and that's just a first glance at the main categories by which he divides up our relation to the world, and then we'll go and read Kant. So I've given out a handout, and I'm showing it online on page 2, which has some, and these are all quotes from Kant, so they have his authority. It's not a summary, which may simplify things. Now, this first one is from the very beginning of the introduction, which we'll be reading more in, but it's so analytic and synthetic judgments. Now, the 4 main terms that are most controverted and most important for Kant are analytic and synthetic, and a priori and a posteriori. And these apply both to judgments and thoughts, cognitions. Now, we've got this odd word cognition, which is usually in certain academic disciplines is quite common. We don't use it in everyday speech as much. It's got this sound, may not be helpful, but it's got this G-N, G-N sound. And the word that's being translated, which is erkennen in the verb, erkenntnis is the noun. And from my very limited understanding, that appears to have the sense of to be acquainted with, to perceive, to recognize, to know, very like the Greek word gignorskein, which also has that G-N in the word cognition. I don't know if that's why they chose it, but if we could do this course in ancient Greek, I would just translate erkennen as gignorskein and we'd be fine. But I don't think we have an English word that really is the same. Because the word perceive, which would be good, because you perceive something, that doesn't mean it's false. That means you can actually see something. But we also sometimes use that of sense perception. And one of the strict things he's trying to do is differentiate strictly all given sense perceptions from how we organize those sense perceptions in our thought, and the thought is therefore radically distinct from the sense perception, and perceive might mess that up. So in other translations, like Jeremy, I don't know what they're doing in the Penguin, but I have knowledge, and so I have seen people justify that by saying that erkennen means to be familiar with someone, to know who they are, etc., and that makes sense.
In German, you surely have wissen and kennen. In
Yes.
German, you surely have wissen and kennen.
That's the problem. If you're going to use knowledge, then you've
English, the kennen is dropped out, I think. Am I right?
Well, we say canny, right? They might have the same root, right?
It's lurking.
Yes, but we don't have it.
Use it.
We don't have it in ordinary discourse. But if you're translating a philosophical text, it's impossible to have either a literary one that conveys this quote unquote style, or one that's literal and that gives you word for word. Both are impossible. If you're going to veer one way, you veer towards the literal, and then you can see an unusual word being used in an unusual context, and you gradually begin to understand what the author means. And so cognize is not a bad compromise in that sense. You're using a slightly unfamiliar word, and we have to figure out what it means.
Is it correct that some translations use the word knowledge instead of cognition? Is that
yes?
Said?
So I think that is the case with the main rival to our Cambridge, which is Werner Pluhar's Hackett version of the First Critique, and it seems to be the case with the Penguin. So there is this. Yeah, this is just a problem of an essential problem of translation, but. Okay, so back to the text. Analytic and synthetic judgments. This is in all judgments in which the relation of a subject to the predicate is thought. Okay, so that is a human being, or that chair is red, right? So you're linking something to something about that thing, right? And that's a judgment. All of our judgments or assertions, propositions, have that structure, subject and predicate. And he says, yeah, if I consider only affirmative judgments, since the application to negative ones is easy. So ignore the bracketed remark. This relation of the subject to the predicate is possible in two ways. Now, what he's going to say is something of an innovation. Right? It depends upon logical theory of his time, which he agrees with, but he's making it an extremely comprehensive understanding of how we think. Right? So either the predicate B belongs to the subject A as something that is covertly contained in this concept A, or B lies entirely outside the concept A, though to be sure it stands in connection with it. Okay, so it would be helpful if he said, I now give you 5 examples. The example that every book on Kant I've ever read, which is not a large proportion of the literature, it's a minuscule proportion, but uses the example of, well, bachelor. A bachelor is an unmarried man. Right? So the term bachelor, and now we have a word here, concept, which is going to need to be argued about, but the term bachelor means a man who's unmarried. So when you say a bachelor is an unmarried man, all you're doing is explicating, you're clarifying that term. You're not adding something to that term which would allow you to discover something new. For example, if I said all bachelors drink too much, right? That would be, I'm now saying there is something about bachelors that is not contained in the very understanding of the term bachelor. It's not just that they're unmarried, but they behave in this way.
I think that's understood in the word bachelor.
This is the problem. The problem is that we then immediately have arguments about what is essential to the term and not. But I think you're relying on a posteriori empirical judgment, not upon a priori deduction. That's just my sense. I'm not sure who you live with or anything, but anyway. Okay. So I've tried. Yeah, this is an example that's often given of the predicate B, which is unmarried man, doesn't add anything to the subject A, bachelor, whereas the predicate B, or if I say all bachelors drink too much, or unmarried men who drink too much, then I'm adding information that's not contained in the subject term A. So now he says, in the first case, I call the judgment analytic, and he calls it that because the word analytic means to, it's a perfectly useful Greek word, analusis, which means to loosen up something, to loosen it up, so you take it apart and you can see its elements. So all you're doing, you've got a whole, bachelor or some other thing, and you just take it up into its parts. Unmarried man. I call this, and in the second case, he says, I call it synthetic, another perfectly good Greek word, synthesis, which means to put together. Right? So you're putting together unmarried man and drinking too much, and you're saying, I put these two together and I've given you more information than you had when I just say the word bachelor. So this is analytic and synthetic judgments. Right? That is, propositions that contain a subject and a predicate. Okay, so analytic judgments, affirmative ones, are thus those in which the connection of the predicate is thought through identity. So a bachelor is identical with an unmarried man. But those in which the connection is thought without identity are to be called synthetic. That is, if I say bachelors are unmarried men who drink too much, that's not an analysis of the concept bachelor. I've added something to it. So therefore he says, I call the first judgments of clarification. You're just analysing a term. I'm saying term and he's saying concept. I don't believe that concepts exist, so we have a problem. But we'll use his terminology and we'll try and understand what he's saying. So judgments of clarification and judgments of amplification, because you've amplified your knowledge of what the term means. Where you've amplified your knowledge of the subject referred to in the term. So analytic and synthetic. Right. Now, a priori and a posteriori cognitions, perceptions, thoughts, right? Recognitions or something. It is therefore at least a question requiring closer examination, and one not to be dismissed at first glance, whether there is any such cognition independent of all experience and even of all impressions of the senses. And and he says one calls such cognitions a priori. So it's a Latin phrase meaning from beforehand, right? So from before, and what is it before? Sense perception. Is there anything that is prior to all sense perception that organizes our sense perception? Now, his first point, and we read this paragraph in the first paragraph of the introduction last week. He immediately makes the point. He says, I'm not talking about temporal priority. I'm not saying that you have thoughts that are active about time and space, or concepts that are active in the understanding temporally before you experience something. You have to have something given to you to think it. What is that? No. So it's not a temporal priority, it's priority in terms of our experience of it. Is the experience formed by a prior capacity on our part, or is the thing given fully to us as what it is? So cognitions a priori, he's raising this as a question at this point in the introduction. Is there any such thing? Is there a perception, a knowledge prior to all sense impressions? And he says, as opposed to empirical ones, which have their sources a posteriori, namely in experience. So an empirical cognition, so that he's dividing cognitions up. Are there a priori ones, and are there, in addition to empirical ones? So an empirical cognition that's a dog, that's a radiator, the wall is coloured cream, and so on. It's raining, the tree's wet, just where you connect a subject and a predicate based upon your sense experience. So he raises the question, and he's going to answer it strongly in the affirmative. Quote, we will understand by a priori cognitions, not those that occur independently of this or that experience, but rather those that occur absolutely independently of all experience. He actually very generously provides an example here, and he says if someone is digging under their house, underneath the foundations, and the house collapses, he says, you could say they could have known a priori, that is beforehand, that this would be the result. But that's not a priori in his sense, that's not prior to all sense perception, because to know that houses need foundations that aren't undermined, you need to have an experience of what a house is, and of what a foundation is, and to put them together, and so on. So that's an a priori in a relative sense. He means prior to all experience. Okay. So opposed to them are empirical cognitions, or those that are possible only a posteriori, i.e. through experience. Among a priori cognitions, however, those are called pure, with which nothing empirical is intermixed. Thus, for example, the proposition every alteration has its cause is an a priori proposition, only not pure, since alteration is a concept that can be drawn only from experience.
Yeah, I was questioning that.
Please, if you grab thank you.
Yeah, I just stopped when I read that, and I thought, is that? Yeah, I didn't even come to a conclusion, but I just thought, really, alteration cannot be known before seeing things like alter, or having that. It can't be abstract.
Similarly, it sort of puts bodies in a priori space. That's the wrong way of putting it, but whereas alteration somehow is in the domain of experience. Bodies can be thought a priori.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
So Cameron makes the point that he's making body in one sense a priori, but what we associate always with bodies, such as alteration, is not put in the same region as being a priori. And one example he's giving in this page is, for example, if I say that a body has extension, that's an analytic judgment, and if I perceive that, it's an a priori cognition. But if I say all bodies are heavy, then I am making a synthetic judgment, and it has to be based on a posteriori experience, because I have to experience bodies to know that they're heavy. Now, that's a very for me, it's counterintuitive, I think, for anyone, that if you have a body, it has some weight. If it's a feather, it has a very light weight, and so on. How is he able to make this distinction? And he's able to do it only on the basis of this Cartesian break between ideas and world. That there are, Descartes defines an idea as any aspect of what you're aware of your consciousness. I mean, you know how he goes through this process of, like, I can doubt that those ideas are connected to things. I can doubt the sense perceptions and so on. So that he's invented a new realm. If the older people are right, like Aristotle, then there's no such thing as of an idea in that sense. What there is more or less accurate perceptions of the eidos, of the form, of the things. But Descartes is making this break. Now, if you make that break, and then you can say that I'm now going to consider body under the impression that all my sense perceptions could be false, which is what Descartes does, then what can I know about body? Only that it's extended. And his example, Descartes' example, is if I have a piece of wax, under different conditions, it'll have a different shape, it'll give off odour when it's heated, it'll run when it's heated, it'll be less or more porous, and so on and so forth, under different conditions. So therefore, he says, what's the truth of any bodily thing? That it's extended. Not these sense perceptions, because they can all change. Right? Now, the immediate counterintuitive is that going to work with a dog? No. If you warm up a dog, at one point it's no longer going to be a dog. Right? And we will hopefully stop your experiments immediately. I'm not saying Descartes is deliberately using the wax because it's in Aristotle's De Anima, and he's trying to transfer from the mind to the body this phenomena. But okay, that was a bit of a okay. So yes, please. Thanks, Cameron.
The source, when you're talking about Descartes saying certain things,
yeah,
are you thinking of a particular text by Descartes? Or?
Well, that's in the second meditation on first philosophy, where he uses the wax to try and show that that body is essentially. So, I mean, Descartes and Kant, they're both arguing against that traditional philosophical tradition that to be is to be a thing of a particular kind. And they're trying to argue, though, to be bodily is not first to be of a particular kind, it's to be extended. That's the first thing. That's what body means, right? But that means changing our whole approach to things. That means saying that our ordinary experience of things is in some way illusory. Bacon makes the same thing when he talks about the ordinary course of nature in the New Organon. He is saying in the ordinary course of nature, there are things of particular kinds, humans, artifacts, and he is trying to say, no, what's real is the corpuscles, the bodily, we would now say, the atomic structure or something, the underlying nature that can be manipulated by natural law. And what we experience is a projection of our human point of view. But I don't want to take us away from the text too much, but I just wanted to explain that, like, this thought that, and Kant is doing this in a new way with these new terms, but he's in some ways dependent upon what Descartes has made persuasive. Yeah. Did you want to?
So it's judgments that are either analytic or synthetic.
Judgments and cognitions can be both analytic, synthetic, or a priori and a posteriori.
Yeah.
Judgments and thoughts or knowledge, yeah.
Judgments and thoughts. And concepts seem to me to sort of map quite well onto thoughts.
Yes.
But yeah, there is something in this construction of how this works. And maybe, Brett's observation's a bit of a tell for Kant that, he does have this idea that the concepts are already coherent. And that's why, change or mutability is something that's outside this, pure world.
There's a very extremely interesting paragraph in the preface, which, if I can lay my hand on it immediately. Yeah, I can't. So I'll make a note, because that's something we need to follow up, because he's not explicitly, but yeah, he's making this case that the concept is the same, doesn't matter who uses it. Mm-hmm. So whereas say for Plato and Aristotle, a thought, can be more or less full, more or less true about whatever it's about. An animal or the notion of justice or whatever it is, and Kant is saying I'm changing that. It's the same concept. It's not moral, not appearance and reality. But we need to go on with the text, because we need more Kant telling us how it all is.
All right.
Okay, so that's our first introduction. We're going to keep reading passages where these terms occur, and we will learn more about what they mean, and we will learn how they cross over, because he's going to make the claim, obviously, that there are a priori but synthetic cognitions. And his book is a proof that there are those cognitions. So we'll come to that, because that's an important passage. Okay, so just metaphysics. This is from the preface. He says, and maybe this will, I'm just going to stop and just say one thing. Okay, so in the book, we have what Descartes calls an idea, Kant calls what's translated as a representation. Ran out of room. Which it would be better. It would be sort of meaningless, but it would be better translated as a presentation, like any idea that's present to you. It's not a representation of something you've seen. Okay, it's something present to the mind. Now. He proceeds in the following way. We have to begin with what's given to us, right? And what's given to us is what he calls, sensibility. And he's going to show that there are a priori, there's an a priori sensibility in our cognition of space and time. That's the transcendental aesthetic. So therefore, but we start with the transcendental aesthetic, because that's what's given to us. So we have sense perception, right? And then he goes to the aspect of the mind that organizes sense perception, and he calls that understanding. And it organizes the mind through concepts. Now, so far we just have a purely mechanical physical world, organized in space and time. There are certain things of certain kinds with certain features that are organized according to our concepts. And he explains the concept as a rule. Right? So a number of things has what he calls a mark, like that they have a certain color. And then we have a concept of black that we apply as a rule to all those things that have that mark. And then we start to draw conclusions from that using our reason. Right? And this is where we get into trouble, because we start to use rules or concepts that apply to bodies and apply them to things that aren't bodies. And okay, and this is why in our text, and I'll go back to the handout so I can just want to very quickly show you just the table of contents in another of the handouts. So this is the front of the second handout, but I'm going to, yeah. So when he's talking in the first part of the book, we have the transcendental aesthetic, and then we go to the transcendental logic. And by logic, he doesn't mean if A, then B, blah, blah, blah. He means our rational understanding of the world. And that means understanding and reason. Like these are our intellectual capacities, our logical capacities, right? But that's got two parts. The transcendental analytic, which is how we use our concepts of the understanding to cognize the world, to organize the world into intelligible aspects, right? And then there's part two, the transcendental dialectic, and that's how our reason uses concepts derived from our relation to the physical world and falsely tries to say that there are supra-physical, supra-natural beings, like a human soul and a god and so on, and human freedom, right? And he is saying there is no cognition here. You're mistakenly using these concepts, and that's why the transcendental dialectic is a logic of illusion, right? But we are all talking in this first part. He's talking theoretically. There's no theoretical knowledge of these things, and we'll get to the point where he says, but in practical philosophy, in morality, that's a different matter. Now,
Martin,
yes,
question.
yeah.
Last week and possibly the week before, you defined reason as being something that is universal and visible to anyone. Is that something that Kant says, or is that your understanding of what he says, or what?
If you look at the top of the handout now that I have this, top of page 3, right?
Yep.
Now, there's a problem. When I said that, I was talking about reason in general, right? And when Kant talks about reason in general, yes, he says that it's that which is intelligible to any human being in principle at any time. He would completely agree with that. But within the Critique of Pure Reason, so he will sometimes say reason and mean that, but within the Critique of Pure Reason, he makes a very strict distinction between understanding and reason. Right? So the same term is used generally to mean a rational human capacity, and also very specifically to mean inferences made from concepts derived from our experience. Right? So we have to be aware of that. Yep.
I'm still getting used. I'm just trying to understand that subtlety, but looking at the everyday sense that you've articulated,
Yep.
that it's universal and visible to anyone. That's a huge kind of hegemonic claim that we all have an understanding of what something is and that it is visible to everyone.
But he means it in
Isn't that a
exactly
basic
this.
assumption?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. It depends how we interpret it. But he means that everyone is capable of saying that's a dog. That's a rational thing. It's rational to call this four-legged creature running around barking a dog.
But the problem I have with that kind of thinking, I mean, I spent a couple of years in Africa with people who have in a very remote part of Africa,
Yep.
who have a completely different understanding of the world. So we know what a dog is because we're embedded in a world which knows what a dog is. But there will be people who have a different understanding. It could well be a sacred entity.
Yeah.
It's got nothing to do with what our understanding of a dog is.
Yeah. So there are two ways of approaching that. One is to say, well, things are therefore, and this is the interesting thing is that Kant is the beginning of historicism. On the one hand, we have this very intricate rational structure. On the other hand, he is the person who first uses the word culture in its modern contemporary sense and first says that things are historical in his later essays. So he gives birth to this notion that things are culturally relative and historically relative. So you could say, and these are two different traditions coming from Kant, on the one hand, well, the meaning of the being of this animal is different depending upon which culture you're in. Or you could say, on Kantian grounds, the correct understanding is dog. And if people have added illusory aspects to this, then that's because they're mistaken. So you've got to make a choice. You can't say it's a little bit of both. I'm not saying that therefore your foreign policy is that people who you think are mistaken should be corrected by an invasion immediately. That's obviously completely irrelevant to wanting to know the truth, right? But yeah, you have to make that choice. I mean, and Aristotle would say the same thing. He would say, look, there are people who think that Zeus is a god, and Aristotle is very clear. Zeus is not a god. He says in Book Lambda of Metaphysics, he's talking about the first principles of things, and he says, the notion that they are living beings like Zeus and so on and so forth, that was invented for the persuasion of the many. That's beyond consideration for him. So now, but every philosopher, genuine, comprehensive thinker, has said, I am telling you what the truth is, and therefore everything else is illusion. Now we, reading that, have to choose. They're right or they're wrong, right? And we have to have our own understanding, and we can't dodge it by saying, well, it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. No, we have to decide just for our own self-understanding. I just say this, I'm emphatic about this, just because we live in the age of intellectual compromise, where people are wanting to take two things at once, that can't both be true. And I want to try and clarify that when we come across that, and I want to have that conversation, because there's no other point to reading as far as I can tell. Okay, now he says here, reason, top of page 3. So this is the technical sense of reason in the Critique of Pure Reason. A great part, perhaps the greatest part of the business of our reason, consists in analyses of the concepts that we already have of objects, right? So we have an experience of an object, we sense it, and we use our concepts to organize it and say that is a dog. It is a particular kind of substance with a particular kind of attribute. It can be potentially a dog when it's not born, and then it's an actual dog when it's running around in its maturity, and so on and so forth. Now, he is going to say, and he has said already in the preface, the illusion that people create, is by using those concrete concepts and applying them to things that don't have a bodily correlate. And that's why, and going back to the definition of metaphysics. So this is back on page 2, in the middle of page 2, where he's talking about metaphysics as it's previously been, which up until him, it's been a delusion, right? And with him, it becomes a science. So so he's saying that there are unavoidable problems of pure reason. Pure, meaning pure of all sense experience, right? God, freedom, and immortality. Now, I've mentioned before that this is not the tradition, right? That those are not the central metaphysical questions for Aristotle or Plato. Two of them are for Aquinas and for the Christian metaphysical tradition, like immortality of the soul and the existence of God. But freedom, that comes in with modernity, because if everything's mechanical, how is the human freedom? But he has an argument by which he wants to show that they are the inevitable problems of our human reason. But they're unavoidable. And so some people say, Kant is criticizing metaphysics, but it's saying it's unavoidable, so he is partly metaphysical and he's partly not. No, that's just carelessness and not facing the question. He is saying that theoretically there can be no knowledge whatsoever of these things. Anyone who pretends to have knowledge is wrong. But they come back in as postulates necessary for our moral life. So, and we're going to see that later. Okay, so he says, but the science whose final aim in all its preparations is directed properly only to the solution of these problems is called metaphysics, whose procedure is in the beginning dogmatic. And this is his particular understanding of dogmatism, not that someone has a positive teaching. That is, it confidently takes on the execution of this task without an antecedent examination of the capacity or incapacity of reason for such a great undertaking. And so his book is called The Critique of Pure Reason, meaning he's going to understand pure reason's origin and its boundaries and validity. So the critique comes first, and the critique says we can only have theoretical knowledge of mechanical nature, right? But these unavoidable metaphysical problems come back in on the moral side, as we'll see. Okay, so that's metaphysics, which up till now has been an illusion, and he is going to make into a science. Now, transcendental. I call all cognition transcendental that is occupied not so much with objects, but rather with our mode of cognition of objects, insofar as this is to be possible a priori. Another easy, simple, straightforward. Okay, so I call all thinking, like perception, I call it transcendental if it's not about this or that thing. It's about how we perceive a thing, right? Do we perceive it through the senses, or do we organize it through our capacities of understanding? And that means that we organize it a priori. That is, we cannot experience something until that sensibility is organized by our concepts, right? So if I'm looking at that organization of our experience by our concepts, that's a transcendental argument. So he's doing two things. One, there are no transcendent beings, right? There's no immortal soul and God that you can discover as beings, theoretically, right? But there is a transcendental philosophy. There are a priori conditions for the possibility of our experience. And we're going to read some of the passages where he argues that. And this is just the first glance at these major terms. I just thought if we saw them all together, all of these terms together, it might help us when we begin to read some of the text. Now, concept. Now, one must, to be sure, think of every concept as a representation, so an idea, right, that is contained in an infinite set of different possible representations. What does that mean? So it's a representation that is contained in an infinite set of different possible representations as their common mark. So I can see that this is a black jumper, right? The concept black relates to the potentially infinite number of things that look like they're black to me, okay? That present the intelligible character of being black. So the concept is a one related to a many. It's one representation related to very many representations, which thus contains these under itself. So the concept black contains under itself all of the black things that I can experience, which is potentially infinite. But no concept as such can be thought as if it contained an infinite set of representations within itself. That is, you can't deduce from the concept black all the things that are black, or from the concept justice, all the things that are just. Right? They are a one over a many, but you can't deduce the many from the one. Okay, now Peter has brought up the concept of reason, and understanding and reason are the two faculties of our thought. So understanding. If we call the receptivity of our mind to receive representations insofar as it is affected in some way sensibility, so this is what he's saying is given to us. It's only our sense perception, right? Whereas the philosophical tradition up till Descartes was that you receive both the intellectual look of something and the sense perception of a thing. And he agrees with Descartes, we're making a strict division. We only receive the sense perception. Okay, so he says, so our receptivity, what's given to us is what's sensible, perceived by the senses. Then on the contrary, the faculty for bringing forth representations itself, or the spontaneity of cognition, is the understanding. So therefore he's saying we have sense perception, that's the only thing that's given to us. We have this figure, it's got 4 legs, it's brown and it's barking, right? That's not yet the concept dog. We apply the concept dog to this thing that we perceive through the senses. Okay, so that's Now, let me just see. Okay, so what were we meant to do? We were meant to look at the preface as well. So let's look at the preface briefly, and then we'll have a break. There's just a couple of paragraphs that we need to see, starting at page 21 to 22. B 21 to 22 in the marginal pagination. And where are we? That's the introduction. So yeah, and 21 to 22 in the Roman numerals. So not in the introduction. This is back in the B preface. Okay, so starting at B21, I'm starting at the line of B21, which is in the Cambridge, it's page 112, but B21, he says, now after speculative reason has been denied all advance in this field of the supersensible. So he's saying, what I tried to sketch before, he's saying there is no speculative or theoretical knowledge of anything that's not mechanical nature, okay? The supersensible. What remains for us to try is whether there are not data in reason's practical data, and practical means moral, right? Not action, but it means moral principles and standards and experiences. For determining that transcendent rational concept of the unconditioned, what that means we will come to, in such a way as to reach beyond the boundaries of all possible experience, possible sensed experience, right? In accordance with the wishes of metaphysics. That is, cognitions a priori that are possible, but only from a practical standpoint. So are there cognitions, for example, are we able to see from our moral experience that the human psyche has to be free? That it has to be not determined mechanically the way everything else is. And he's going to argue, yes, like given our experience that some things ought to happen, but sometimes don't happen, that ought implies the capacity to choose. Right? And so therefore, since that moral experience is as fundamental a fact as our physical experience, therefore, from the point of view of morality, as a hypothesis for morality, the human psyche has to be understood to be free, but it's not a truth that you can show theoretically. It has no theoretical value. That's difficult to understand, but it's what we're going to try and understand as we go. So, over the page. By such procedures, speculative reason by such procedures as emptying theory or speculation of all truth except what's mechanical nature, speculative reason has at least made room for such an extension for morality, even if it had to leave it empty. And we remain at liberty, indeed, we are called upon by reason to fill it, if we can, through practical data of reason. We are called upon by reason to fill the space left by theory with the understanding of morality. Now, we're going to have to be highly selective in what we look at. These footnotes are very interesting because he's saying in this preface, I'm making this hypothesis that the way I divide the world into a priori and so on is true. And then in the text, I prove it. I make an apodictic proof, a proper demonstration. But we're going to have to sprint onwards to the next passage, which is where? Which is 29 to 30 in the Roman numerals. So XX, IX. Sorry? So we're still in the B preface, and it's B 29, XX, 1x, which is on page 116 of the Cambridge. Okay, I'm going to start at the very line where he says bxxi, 1x, 29, b29, yet that speculative reason, theoretical reason, had proved that freedom cannot be thought at all, right? Because everything's mechanical. So if someone commits a crime, right, why did they commit that crime? Now, if you look at it morally, you might say, well, they made the wrong choice. They needed money, but instead of getting a job, they invaded a home and sold the TV.
Job that they couldn't get.
Sorry?
The job that they couldn't have.
That's a longer argument. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Now, so morally, there's an aspect of choice. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a justice department. It would just be a neurological retraining department, right? So there's some mechanical cause, and we now currently live amongst enormous confusion about this point. Are people doing what they do because of their, quote, culture, quote, socioeconomic status, quote, and these other fictions, right? Are they doing it because of that or reductive categories? Or is there an aspect of choice in what they do? Now, I don't like those categories as being determinant of human action, because people from all backgrounds do all kinds of things. Clearly, these things have an influence, but they're not determinant of human. This is one of the reasons why I think Kant is right to sense that there's a problem with saying you can understand human beings mechanically. I think he's right to suggest that that's a problem. Okay, so he says, yet that speculative reason had proved that freedom cannot be thought at all, then that presupposition, namely the moral one, would necessarily have to yield to the other one whose opposite contains an obvious contradiction. We'll come back. Consequently, freedom, and with it morality, would have to give way to the mechanism of nature. So if our theoretical science is the mechanical science, then there is no human freedom. It cannot be shown theoretically that there is. But then, since for morality I need nothing more than that freedom should not contradict itself, that it should be at least thinkable, that it should place no hindrance in the way of the mechanism of nature in the same action. So we have one action. Someone commits a crime. In one way, we look at it as it's a mechanical thing. You know, the person, they're responding to certain stimuli. You know, they were treated a certain way, they can't get a job, and there are all these stimuli and to which they respond, and they still need to eat, and they can't get a job, and so they steal, right? Now that's stimulus and response. There's no moral judgment there, because they're not acting freely. The moral point of view is that, well, there are other people in that position who did something else, you know, and did not commit the crime. So we're looking at the same action from the point of view of mechanism of nature and from the point of view of there's a moral choice involved. Right. Okay. Where did we get to? The doctrine of morality asserts its place, and the doctrine of nature. Yeah, so he is saying there's going to be a way in my thought where we can have both the doctrine of morality, which asserts that freedom exists, and the doctrine of nature, in which there are natural laws, right? Which, however, would not have occurred if criticism had not first taught us of our unavoidable ignorance in respect of the things in themselves, and limited everything that we can cognize theoretically to mere appearances. Okay, so this is, I've mentioned this before, and this is a very difficult thought, which I'll just try and briefly elaborate very briefly before we go on. But he is saying that because our cognition creates our appearances of everything in time and space, that means that we can't say that we have any knowledge of what things are in themselves beyond that appearance. Because the appearance is relative to our faculties of sensation and thinking. Now, if that's so, then that means that we do not have knowledge of what is in itself, the things in themselves. And that gives him space to say, in itself, there could be freedom. The human soul could be free to act morally. So that's what he means by saying, if criticism, the critique of pure reason, right, the critique of reason, had not taught us of our unavoidable ignorance in respect of things themselves as opposed to how they appear to us necessarily because of our faculties of cognition, right? That limits our theoretical cognition to the appearances, the manifestation of things in space and time. That means that there is a thing in itself, which he's going to say is the locus of our moral disposition. Right? Okay, just the same sort of exposition of the positive utility of critical principles of pure reason. Okay, what he's saying is, my book is useful, not because it's clarifying a few epistemological problems. The usefulness is that I am preventing the mechanical natural science from overwhelming our experience of the specifically human, i.e. morality, and in his later book on aesthetics, beauty. I am trying to preserve the specific human experiences against the empire of science. That's how I would put it. Just the same sort of exposition of the positive utility of criticising reason, criticising the principles of pure reason, can be given in respect to the concepts of God and of the simple nature of our soul, which, however, I forego for the sake of brevity. Thanks. Now, so he is going to say, yeah, we can't say anything about the human psyche or whether or not there's a first principle that people would call God. We can't say anything about that theoretically. We can have no knowledge. But it may be necessary for our moral understanding. As a postulate, he calls it a postulate of pure reason. Okay, thus I cannot even assume God, freedom and immortality for the sake of the necessary practical use of my reason, unless I simultaneously deprive speculative reason of its pretension to extravagant insights. Okay, so on the one hand, he's undertaken an enormous critical endeavour. We don't have time to look at it, but I brought in part of Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologica. And now, if you have time, like there's a famous passage. If you know something about Catholic thought, I just happen to have taught. I'm not Catholic, but I happen to have taught at a couple of Catholic institutions, and so I've read quite a bit of Aquinas. And there's in that understanding, there's a famous passage in the Summa Theologica in the second question of the first book, where he just almost in passing presents 5 proofs for the existence of God, and there are 5 arguments based upon Aristotelian teachings that there must be a first mover. If everything is in motion, if everything that is body, this is Aristotle's beginning point, and everything therefore is in motion, there must be a first motion, otherwise there couldn't be all these derivative motions. Now, what Kant is saying is, you have taken a true characteristic of a body, that it moves, and you've drawn deductions about something that is not bodily, God. And that's illegitimate. That's an illusion. So theoretically, you can't do that, Aquinas, or in your different version, Aristotle. That's a mistake. And that's what he's saying here. I deprive speculative reason of its pretension to extravagant insights into things that aren't physical on the theoretical level, and then the moral comes later. Okay. Now, he says, because in order to attain such insights, speculative or theoretical reason would have to help itself to principles that in fact reach only to objects of possible experience, physical things, sense things, and which, if they were applied to what cannot be an object of experience, then they would always actually transform it into an appearance and thus declare all practical extension of pure reason to be impossible. That's obviously straightforward. Okay, so he says, if these concepts were to be applied to what cannot be an object of experience, they would transform that apparently bodiless, non-physical thing into an appearance, and thus make practical pure reason impossible. Because if you transform what is not experienced into a sensible thing, you've now brought it into this mesh of cause and effect, mechanical nature, and you have transformed what you thought was a metaphysical entity into a physical entity, and you've destroyed your own understanding of reality. And so this is part of his critique of the tradition. If you'll let me just go to one more paragraph, and then we'll have have a break. And then we're actually doing something not remotely unlike what we said we would do. So this is page 34, which is XXX 1, 5. There. Now, okay, so this is just before B35 in the margins, in the Roman numerals. And on the Cambridge text, we're on page 119. Now, I'm starting a few lines before page 35, B35, where he says, through criticism alone. And here I just want to show you who the targets are. Through criticism, that is the critique of theoretical reason, alone can we sever the very root of materialism, fatalism, atheism. So on the one end, of free-thinking unbelief, right? That's on the one hand. So on the one hand, he wants to critique that because his critique of theoretical reason leaves space within things themselves for the notion that materialism is not true, there is a moral choice that human beings have. On the one hand. And then of enthusiasm and superstition, which can become generally injurious. Okay, enthusiasm and superstition. Now, he is going to come up with a notion of morality that is in accord with pure reason. And it's prior to God, right? Now, he doesn't advertise that on the front page because he would like his books to be published and that kind of thing. He wants to keep, he got tenure very late. But, and this is buried in the third part of the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. It's alluded to in this book, but Mill is exactly the same. Like John Stuart Mill, if you read Utilitarianism, buried in the middle of part 5 of the 5 parts, they make exactly the same point, and they allude to exactly the same passage in the New Testament when they make this point, that the reason comprehends the root of good and bad. And that root is prior to any divine entity that you want to discuss, you metaphysicians. Right? So he's not. There's a sense in which he's arguing against atheism because he's saying the notion that there's a free soul and there is a God is morally necessary, but not as something you can know. That's enthusiasm and superstition. So that means the whole tradition that is the religious tradition is also out with the metaphysical tradition. It's really very thoroughgoing, and its thoroughness is not obvious to us because these are cliches, Okay, so then, and finally also of idealism and skepticism. So he's not attacking the religious and the metaphysical tradition and the materialism, modern science. He's attacking all of these, but not by saying skepticism, we can't know anything, and therefore your religion and your metaphysics and your science are inventions. He's not saying that. He's going to secure science as well. So he's attacking skepticism and idealism, the notion that these things are necessary thoughts that we have, but they don't relate to reality itself. We're going to get to reality in itself. So this is his very great ambition, to completely reconceive our experience of the world against both materialism and religion and idealism and skepticism. Okay, yes, please.
Martin, what does he mean by the schools, which he goes on to say these things? Idealism and skepticism, at least in this translation, are more dangerous to the schools.
Yeah, so he means the theologico-academic schools of the time, which were all,
Theological.
Yeah. I mean, the universities started as Christian schools, and so they may have taught, many of them did teach, say, philosophy, but theology is the peak of the sciences. Philosophy was the queen of the human sciences. Theology is the peak from that point of view. And that's why, Kant wrote a book called the strife of the faculties, the conflict of the faculties, and he means between theology and philosophy. And he's trying to make philosophy first, which he does in that way that I mentioned before. That's not a contest for us now. I mean, our institutions of higher learning are thoroughly secular, but that hasn't been a triumph for philosophy, as Kant hoped it would. That philosophy is not the queen of the sciences ordering all the other. It's not the thing saying, it should be from Kant's point of view, from Aristotle's point of view, it would be saying, to understand yourself as a human being, you're going to have to understand certain languages, certain amount of history, you're going to have to understand ethics and politics and natural science, but all of those are ordered within a whole within which you will have a complete self-understanding. We have none of that at the university. They don't say that when you enter, they don't say, here's the program and you're going to become educated. People who end up studying philosophy do it by accident. It's, maybe should I do TV studies, philosophy, economic, you're given a smorgasbord and you pick out, I'm not, I don't know, I haven't been there recently. Okay, sorry, that was a bit of a digression. Okay, so we'll have a break. If you have questions about what we've discussed rapidly, please bring them up after the break and we'll go through it. And then we'll start reading in the introduction and the transcendental study. Thanks. Okay, so if anyone hasn't, we rushed through a few things. If there are any questions from what we did discuss, happy to discuss them. Because I really do want to make progress in understanding things as opposed to progress in page counts. If there aren't any questions, though, I'm keen also to begin reading some parts of the first critique. So,
Are there questions online?
yeah, anyone online have any thoughts that they would like to?
I've got a really quick question.
Yeah.
When he mentions materialism here, like what was the idea of materialism at the time? Because I didn't know about atoms then, right? So it's a different sort of metaphor, I'm guessing, or a different notion.
Well, yeah, I mean, what became atomism emerges out of Bacon's corpuscularianism. And so there are corpuscles, and the corpus is a body. A corpuscle is just a little body. You know how we say icicle? It's a little ice, right? So there are minute bodies with a certain determinate structure that obey natural law. So it's very like an atomism. Yeah, very, very like.
Martin, I have one quick question.
Yep. What is being?
You referred to the unconditional and said you'd bring it up later. I'm not sure if you still intend doing that. Would you like to speak to what he means by the unconditional?
It will definitely come up, but reason tends to want what is not conditioned. So reason wants to abstract from the origin of our concepts in physical things and apply them to things that aren't conditioned. So, for example, the example I gave before about, Aquinas gives a proof for the existence of God based upon a thing that is always, a concept that is always conditioned. Like this dog is potentially a bit bigger. It hasn't fully grown, right? And it's potentially not here, but over there. So actuality and potentiality. Now those are conditioned, that concept is conditioned by the sensed being that I'm experiencing. If I apply that and say everything is potential, there must be an actuality beyond that. I'm applying that actuality, that notion, to a God that has no physical presence that I can sense. And so I'm applying a conditioned concept to something unconditioned. I'm reaching out to the unconditioned from the conditioned. And I want to leave it there because we will definitely be coming back to this because it's in his discussion of reason later on that we'll come to. And we don't have the material yet to look at that properly.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So now if we go to the introduction.
I think there's a question.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
sorry.
yeah, no, sorry. I was just going to ask, this is kind of going back to something from earlier.
Yep.
There's kind of this relationship between the thing and the concept.
Yeah.
And what I was getting from the discussion before was that reason is kind of what bridges the gulf, I guess. So there's the thing that runs around on four legs and barks, and then there's the concept of dog.
Yes.
And then reason is what applies the concept to the thing. Is that kind of...
I have misled you.
Okay.
So our understanding is the deployment of concepts to cognize, to think a thing. Mm-hmm. What is given to us is a sense, like as you say, the thing running, barking, and has different colours, and we cognize that as a dog. The understanding uses concepts to allow us to think that, right? Reason is another capacity that uses those concepts mistakenly and applies them to things that aren't bodily. Yeah.
Okay.
It's the understanding that that applies concepts to the things we sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then how does truth come into this situation?
Well, we have truth at all levels. So in our now this is where, like, these terms, objective and subjective, that we all use all the time, that's a very new understanding of what truth is. And it comes directly from Kant, who is saying that in an object we impart the truth to it. Right? So that is transcendentally ideal. That is, it comes from our ideas. And this is not terminologically correct, so I just have to make myself intelligible. But he does use the following expression: our perceptions are, our cognition of things, objects that we can sense, are transcendentally ideal. They come from our ideas, but they are empirically objective or real. Because we can't sense things except that they're in space or time. So this is the reality for beings that are constituted like us, who have both thought and sense perception. So they are empirically real, but they are transcendentally ideal. And that's where we get objective truth and subjective truth, because the objective truth is when the subject has formed the object properly. But then if we are deluded and or intoxicated and we misform, then it's subjective only and not objective.
So how do we form a correct perception of an object or of a... So if we're talking about dogs as an example, we might think of a dog as like an animal. Yeah. And I think the example before was that there's other cultures that kind of revere them as more than that. Yeah. So how do we get to, I guess, kind of a true concept of the dog? How do we get there? Or can we? Yeah. No, we can. Science, the science that says, of biology, that says there are dogs of these and that kind and so on, that is the truth of dogs, right? And we can do that only, Kant is saying, I am establishing the foundations to allow what is currently called biology to be a true science, because I am giving it this architectural foundation, right? And therefore I am showing you why you can show to those people that they're deluded about it being a god. It's just a dog. And he does this in the middle of this book. And I am showing you why you would want to think that we invent gods because of our moral experience. And then we transpose that moral experience onto our theoretical experience and say there is a God, as opposed to saying it's a necessary postulate of practical reason. Now, that's venturing far into the future, i.e. 2 weeks for us. So let's go back to the text, because I hope that something of what he says here about space and time will... Actually, we're just at the beginning of the introduction. I've got a bit more, but maybe I'll
leave
it till later.
Actually, no, go. Go.
Is it always kind of morality at play that makes these differences? Because when we were talking about it before, the example that came to mind for me is that I think it's Inuit people have about like 8 different words for snow.
Yep.
And there's kind of different discrete types of it.
Yep.
Whereas if we think about snow, we think about the stuff that falls from the sky, sets on the ground.
Yeah.
It's all kind of one thing. There's no difference.
I used to teach a course, and there was a sociologist who was teaching a course immediately before, and so every year, for several years in a row, I would begin to teach, say, Plato, and say, look, there could be some truth in our experience. Because everyone is brought up as a nihilist, yes? And so you have to spend a few weeks saying, if I give you, a grade based upon a mark based upon your height, you'd be upset because you do think there is such a thing as justice. It's not all really blah, blah, blah. You have to make these arguments at first. And so I would make these arguments, and the next week, every semester, people would come in with this picture of, look, these Inuits think that there are 17 different colours of snow. That means it's not the same as our experience of snow. But I don't find that persuasive. Because if someone, they're paying more attention to the snow because so much depends upon it for their livelihood and so on.
Yeah.
So we're just not paying attention. And so there are those distinctions in that one substance that has the same characteristics in their experience and our experience.
And so that would be related way more to perception than to morality then?
That's right. It wouldn't be related to morality. That's right. It would be an instrumental thing. Like this snow means that the ice is this deep. Sorry?
There's another example. This is from Merleau-Ponty. He talks about this.
Yep.
But there's some cultures that can see a much wider spectrum of greens and blues, but they can only see one red.
Yeah.
So this in that cup and that chair would all be one thing, like not orange, not red, or whatever.
Right.
So, but that would relate to the way they interact in their environment and the different kind of things they encounter and how their perception is a bit different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm trying to answer you from 4 different points of view at once.
Right.
But first of all, from Kant's point of view, he has no problem saying that there's one scientific view of colours, and if you pay more attention, it'll be like this. And if you have a particular tradition that modifies that, then that's the result of your tradition. It's not the theoretical truth. The same with the dog that's a god and a dog. You've transposed something that comes from another part of your experience to the scientific truth.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what he would say, and but I think we all know that habit, custom, culture have this enormous effect. But what's the truth? That's the question. Yeah.
Sorry, did you have to? I was just going to hazard adding something further, but when we speak about various words for an object, we're also talking about the various concepts that exist. So there's a variety of concepts that could apply to various objects as well. We're saying nothing about anything in itself beyond that. Now I've lost my train of thought, but I felt I needed to say that in response to what you were just discussing.
Yeah, so that's why I introduced this phrase, which I want to read in context today: transcendentally ideal but empirically real. So there is only one right way to cognize things for us, given our sensual and mental apparatus. Yep.
But us is viewed.
Humans.
Us is viewed, I suppose, globally in that sense.
Yes, and so in itself there might be a being with a different kind of intellectual apparatus that perceives a thing in itself differently from our appearance that we create with create's the wrong word, but we constitute as a being of this sort with those attributes. Yeah. Let's read him on this, because I am much less adequate at summarising what he's saying than he is doing. And that won't be till the end of the introduction, after the end of the transcendental aesthetic, which we definitely need to read a paragraph on that. Let's just read the first paragraph in the introduction. I think we've read this before, but again. So this is at A, sorry, are we on the B? The B introduction. Yeah, the B introduction. Yeah. Yeah, so it's B1, and in the Cambridge, it's page 136. And it's capital Roman numeral 1 on the difference between pure and empirical cognition. And we're reading the Critique of Pure Reason.
So there is no doubt whatever that all our cognition begins with experience, sense perception. For how else should the cognitive faculty be awakened, that's the understanding, be awakened into exercise if not through objects that stimulate our senses and in part themselves produce representations, in part bring the activity of our understanding into motion to compare these, to connect or separate them, and thus to work up the raw material of sense impressions into a cognition of objects that is called experience. So we experience a dog, right? Now, what he's saying is that with the sense perception alone is this disorganized multitude of impressions, brown, four legs, barking sound. It's only the understanding that can cognize the dog as a dog. So the sense perception is necessary to awaken the understanding, but it's the understanding that constitutes the object. Yes.
But it seems to me sufficient insofar as we've progressed to say that insofar as there is a concept that's adequate to the object, that we have a truth claim.
So can you...
Insofar as there is a concept that is adequate to the object that's represented to us in the senses.
Yes.
So we have a concept that matches an experience of that object.
Right.
That we have a sufficient in that relation for a truth claim.
Yes, for an objective truth. That objective in the sense that we've constituted an object. Yeah.
Okay.
But and then he has to explain, okay, so if the understanding constitutes an object through concepts, how do you make a mistake? Right. And which he wants to claim as well. Then you have to say, well, it's a defective constitution of the object. So then we have an objective truth. We've constituted an object according to the concepts of the understanding, or we have a merely subjective experience, which is not objective.
Just quickly, I have a question also following on that. For the objective truth, and this is maybe skipping ahead in the history of philosophy a bit, but does Kant require that there is a term, like a word in linguistically for the understanding to bring something into a fully sensed thing? So if we didn't have a word for dog, like if we experienced a new species and is that pre-linguistic or what's kind of happening?
I don't think we have trouble saying there's a genus and that we discover a new species. Yeah. Because he's not saying that. Remember when he said the concept is a representation of representations. The representations are potentially infinite, of which the concept that is a representation recognizes. And there could be infinite in its variety, because there could be an infinite variety of things. I was using the example of things that show the color black, right? But there could be a lot of variety of dogs that show the basic concept of dog. Now, there's all kinds of problems with that, right? Problems that don't exist for Plato and Aristotle, because there's no a priori eidos. There's an eidos exhibited by the dog. And so if they've got a new kind of dog, it's a variation in the eidos. That's not a problem. That's a problem for Kant, I think. But let's make some progress with the text. So page B4, just before B5 in the B introduction, which is on page 138 of the translation, he says, now it is easy to show, it's one of the biggest lies in the history of philosophy, it is easy to show that in human cognition there actually are such necessary and in the strictest sense universal, thus pure a priori judgments. So the claim that we are reading in a paragraph 2 where he has said that which is entitled, we are in possession of certain a priori cognitions and even the common understanding is never without them. So in our thinking there are judgments and thoughts, cognitions, that are absolutely pure of experience. That's the claim, and he's now going to say, I can demonstrate that easily. 2 examples, right? If one wants an example from the sciences, one need only look at all the propositions of mathematics. If one would have one from the commonest uses of the understanding, the proposition that every alteration must have a cause will do, right? Indeed, in the latter, the very concept of a cause so obviously explains the concept of a necessity, of connection with an effect, and a strict universality of rule that it would be entirely lost if one sought, as Hume did, to derive it from a frequent association of that which happens with that which precedes, and a habit, thus a merely subjective necessity of connecting representations arising from that association. Now, no one's ever accused Kant of being a poet, and we take several different directions at once. So, but the first thing is there are pure a priori judgments, e.g. maths. So he actually develops the example of mathematics, which I desperately want to find, because then we're actually talking about something we might be able to understand. Right, okay, so we have to go to B15, which is later in this introduction. Just after B15, a paragraph begins with, to be sure, one might initially think that the proposition 7 plus 5 equals 2 is a merely analytic proposition that follows from the concept of a sum of 7 and 5 in accordance with the principle of contradiction. Now, he's discussing this now because he wants to say that there are cognitions, thoughts, knowledge, perception, that is a priori, free of all sense perception, and synthetic. It's not just from an analysis of concepts. Right? Now, so we're going to get both of that in this mathematical example. So he's trying to say it's, first of all, it's not just analytic. You can't analyze the concept 7, the concept plus addition, and the concept 5. That won't give you the concept 12. Right? So therefore, it's not an analytic proposition. 7 plus 5 is 12. It's not an analysis of the elements that on the one side. It's synthetic. You put things together, literally, in this case, you add together 7 and 5 and get 12. Is that acceptable?
I find that very persuasive.
That's persuasive. I think that's persuasive. Now it's the next bit.
Yeah.
Okay. Then he says, yet if one considers it more closely, one finds that the concept of the sum of 7 and 5 contains nothing more than the unification of both numbers in a single one, through which it is not at all thought what this single number is, which comprehends the two of them. So you can't analyze 7 and 5 to get 12. The concept of 12 is by no means already thought, merely by my thinking of that unification of 7 and 5, and no matter how long I analyze my concept of such a possible sum, I still will not find 12 in it. One must go beyond these concepts, seeking assistance in the intuition that corresponds to one of the two, the 5 and the 7. One's 5 fingers, say, or in Segner's arithmetic, 5 points, and after that, add the units of the 5 given in the intuition to the concept of 7. And now, blah, 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 blah.
It's interesting though that he's talking.
Yep.
It's interesting though that he's talking about intuition here because, I mean, the example he gives is the use of one's fingers.
Yes.
But by the same token, that intuition could be completely internal. It could be an inner experience that's nonetheless the intuition of an object that's internal.
Yes. Now, I don't think... Yeah, I don't think he's referring to sense perception. It's... I don't want to say intellectual intuition because that's entirely out.
No, but it's presupposed by this particular sense perception.
Yeah.
Because, a five is just 5 individual, united, coherent wholes. Like that's how you get to 5. That's how you get to 7.
Yeah.
So they're a priori insofar as they already presuppose a unity. So where's he getting that from? Where's he getting? I mean, it's in the idea of a number.
It's a priori in the same sense that in Aristotle and Plato they talk about in the intelligibility of mathematical things. So if we have, if you've got fingers, if you have 7 fingers and you add 5, or if in your head you have 7 points and you add 5 to it, in some way we put together something and something, but it doesn't matter what we use, we always get the same result, right? So that means that there is an a priori truth to the truths of mathematics that is not just analysis. That's his point here.
Yes.
Or is he just making the point about synthetic judgment? Not so much whether it's a priori or not.
No, he's definitely he's making the claim that this is a priori synthetic judgment. And if there is anything that is a priori synthetic judgment, then there can be a critique of pure reason.
Can I interrupt?
Yep.
Isn't this all predicated on a particular way of understanding the world? So, I mean, the number 5, what is it? I mean, to my mind, philosophically, we've got to start thinking about identity and difference. So 5 assumes that you've got 5 ones, and therefore there's as Kirsten says, a unity. But that's all kind of basic assumptions about how we understand the world, rather than basic truths.
Okay, so we do have to look. Well, everyone has a different view of this. I mean, all of these people. Yeah, Aristotle, Aquinas, Kant, they have a different view of what a number is. And we're to try and understand what Kant is doing, we're going to have to suspend our skepticism briefly. Because they are arguing that number has a different meaning for human life. But you've put your finger on a very important point, which is we're taking there to be an intelligible unity that we can then base, say, 7 on or 5 on. Yes?
Yes.
And now, this is the key point in the difference between Kant and some prior thinkers, is that he is saying the only source of unity is the synthesis that we perform. There is no unity in the things themselves that we perceive. Right? And so it's a priori synthetic because it issues from the understanding itself. Only he is saying that's why we can have certainty, because it's an aspect of our own understanding. That's why we can have certainty. Whereas Plato and Aristotle argue that, the reason why 2 and 2 is 4 is because we pure units added together are stable and can be manipulated, and you always get the same answer. But the key point of all of, in fact, of ancient and modern philosophy is what is the source of the unity of things. Right? That is a very key point. And Kant is saying, he says at the beginning of a later chapter, which we're not getting to, that the source of all unity is the operation of our cognitive apparatus. Okay, but I want to move on, just because.
Thank you.
I'm not giving Kant enough space. And I'm going to pretend we understand synthetic a priori. Okay, so let's have a look at the beginning of part 6 of the introduction in B. The general problem of pure reason. which is as follows. One has already gained a great deal if one can bring a multitude of investigations under the formula of a single problem. Yeah. And his single problem is, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? And now, so what, and then over the page, so this is B20, towards the end of B20, that general question, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? That comes down to three subsidiary questions. One, how is pure mathematics possible? So he is assuming mathematics is a science, a genuine science. It gives us necessary and universal results. And in the first part of the introduction, those are the two marks of a priori. If something is necessary and universal, we cannot derive it from experience. So that he's in agreement with Hume. If Hume says, doesn't matter how many, Hume says, if you observe the fact that this stone grows warm because of the sun is beaming upon it, you will form the habit of thinking, the sun causes the heat. But that's not knowledge, because it's just a number of empirical experiences. It's not a necessity. It's not universal. It can't be shown mathematically. Now, Kant is saying, well, au contraire. So we know that there are two areas where we have a priori truths that are universal and necessary. 2 and 2 is always 4. That's one. Second, he assumes also that there is natural science in the Newtonian model. So we can have laws of motion, right, that are universal and necessarily true. Proof, we can now show where the planets are and so on. Okay, so that's why he's saying, he's looking at how is pure mathematics possible and how is pure natural science possible. He's saying we have these as a priori synthetic cognitions. But then he says, as far as metaphysics is concerned, his question, and here it's in bold next to B22 in the margin, how is metaphysics as a natural predisposition possible? That is, why are we by nature predisposed to use our mathematical and our scientific reasoning about bodies and number, and then apply that to things that we can't have theoretical knowledge of, the soul, freedom, and God, right? So he's going to explain why that as a natural predisposition is possible, why it's an error, and the true purpose of metaphysics, which is to critique pure reason in the theoretical use and to promote its use in practical reason, for pure practical reason. Now I'm just using words that don't have a lot of substance in without some amplification, and which we're going to get from the next chapter, I hope. So this is chapter 7 in the introduction. Okay, so the idea and division of a special science under the name of a critique of pure reason. So the title of his book. So, From all of this, there results the idea of a special science which can be called the critique of pure reason. For reason is the faculty that provides the principles of cognition a priori. Okay, that's difficult because he hasn't discussed reason. He's discussed the understanding, but not reason. Hence, pure reason is that which contains the principles for cognizing something absolutely a priori. Now, are there a priori principles? Yes, like what he's going to argue. On the sensible level, yes, there's an a priori principle of time and space. And there are a priori principles of the understanding concepts that organize our temporal and spatial experience. And the science of those things, he says at A12 under B25, a system of such concepts that are a priori would be called transcendental philosophy. So that's what he's doing. There are no transcendent beings. There is a transcendental philosophy which shows us the origin of our cognition of certain things in reason or in sensibility. Now these are terms that we have not fully grasp the meaning of, and to just begin to see what is going on, we're going to have a look at the beginning of the B transcendental aesthetic, which, is page B74 in the Cambridge. It's page 193. So B74, the Transcendental Doctrine of Elements, second part, the Transcendental Logic, Introduction, the idea of the Transcendental Logic. I've gone too far, sorry, I apologise, I need the aesthetic. This is because they print both the A and B of each of these chapters, I get confused, so I apologise. We're actually at B33, right, which is the first part of the Transcendental aesthetic. So it's aesthetic. Aesthesis is a good Greek word meaning perception. In the philosophers, it becomes sensual perception, sense perception, aesthesis. Transcendental aesthetic means, well, what are the a priori categories that, a priori forms that constitute our sense perception? Okay. So, beginning of the paragraph, in whatever way and through whatever means a cognition may relate to objects, that through which it relates immediately to them and at which all thought as a means is directed as an end is intuition. So our thinking relates to what's given to us. What's given to us is what we intuit, or intuition means take in. Okay? This, however, takes place only insofar as the object is given to us, but this in turn, at least for us humans, is possible only if it affects the mind in a certain way. Right? And he explains that way in the next sentence. The capacity or receptivity to acquire representations through the way in which we are affected by objects is called sensibility. So for human beings, what's given is what is given through the senses. Objects are therefore given to us by means of sensibility, and it alone affords us intuitions. Objects are given through the senses, right? But they are thought through the understanding. And that means we constitute objects through the understanding. And from it, from the understanding, arise concepts. But all thought, whether straight away or through a detour, must, by means of certain marks, ultimately be related to intuitions. That's his claim that our theoretical knowable experience is of objects that we sense. Now it looks like we will have to depart in 2 minutes. Ooh. So if anyone had a quick question, that would be great. We have not made very much progress into the aesthetics, which I didn't think we're going to conquer all of that. I am going to just ruthlessly march on, so I will try and say a few things that help get us to the text that I've put in that revised schedule, and we'll look at a couple of pages from the Transcendental Logic next time. So we'll follow the revised schedule. If what happens is that makes everything entirely mysterious, we will stop and go return. So just let me know how things are going, and we will do things that make sense. If you had any final thoughts, please.
Excellent class. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks. Did you?
Just one thought. I keep coming back to this idea of concepts, I'm now getting a sense, now that we've got to the aesthetic, that that concepts are built up of these infinite experiences, which are finite in our particular cases, but they're not fixed, and they're not, and they're
the concepts.
The concepts. They're not exact.
It's all right. It's all right.
Yep.
I'm afraid.
Well, we're
going to be kicked out.
All right.
So we will pursue. We will pursue. So please save up your questions, and we will address everything and become wise early next week.
That's yours.
See you next week. Thank you.